A 2-hour drive to my wedding was too exhausting for my family, but flying across 15 states to the West Coast to toast my sister, everyone arrived perfectly on time, wearing the exact dress code, striking the right angles. 32 days later, my phone exploded with 214 missed calls. It was not because they missed me, it was because they just discovered the man they completely ignored is the only person left who can save them. My name is Ariana Chapman. I am 32 years old, and for as long as I can recall, my assigned place at the Chapman family Sunday dinners has remained exactly the same. We reside in a sprawling, immaculately landscaped estate in Charlotte, North Carolina, a house designed entirely around the concept of making an impression on guests who will never actually live there. Our dining room is a cavernous space anchored by a massive, custom-milled mahogany table that could comfortably seat 14 people. Yet, week after week, year after year, I am relegated to the single chair pushed right up against the swinging door that leads directly into the kitchen. It is a highly strategic placement, though no one in my family would ever be crass enough to admit it out loud. Sitting in that spot, I am constantly brushed by the cold draft of the swinging wooden door, forced to lean forward awkwardly, just to catch the flow of conversation at the opposite end of the room, and positioned perfectly to clear the dirty plates, fetch the forgotten salt shaker, or refill empty wine glasses. I do not sit at that table like a beloved firstborn daughter. I sit there like a temporary resident, a mildly tolerated tenant, or perhaps a reliable member of the catering staff who has been granted a brief, begrudging moment to rest her legs before the next course is served. This physical distance at the dining table is merely a surface reflection of a much deeper, colder truth about my lineage. The Chapman family is a beautifully orchestrated illusion, a glittering, high-gloss facade constructed for the sole purpose of public consumption and societal envy. At the absolute helm of this daily operation is my mother, Lorraine Chapman. Lorraine is the founder and chief executive officer of Bellwether Home Atelier, a highly successful chain of luxury furniture boutiques that caters aggressively to the old money and new tech wealth of the American South. My mother approaches our family life with the exact same ruthless, curatorial eye she applies to her expensive showroom floors. To Lorraine, a person only holds actual value if they possess a certain aesthetic currency, if they are, in her exact philosophy, worth showing off to the country club or the local lifestyle magazines. Affection in our household is never given unconditionally. It is a transactional currency, allocated only to those who yield the highest social return on investment. With my practical clothes, my quiet demeanor, and my deep resistance to being styled like a showroom mannequin, I have never been considered a prime asset. Then there is my father, Grant Chapman. He owns a boutique financial consulting firm called Chapman Advisory Group, in the grand, loud, constantly moving theater of our family. My father has perfected the quiet art of total invisibility. He is a man who speaks so little he practically vanishes from the room even while sitting squarely at the head of the table. He never raises his voice, never initiates a conflict, and crucially, never intervenes to stop one from happening. His silence is not peaceful. It is profoundly cowardly and deeply complicit. By completely refusing to participate in the major emotional decisions of our household, or to address the glaring, painful favoritism that dictates our daily lives, he silently blesses the unjust order my mother enforces. He hides behind his endless paperwork and his expensive evening scotch, becoming a willing accomplice through his total inaction. The undeniable center of gravity in the Chapman universe, the radiant sun around which my parents orbit with desperate, eager devotion, is my younger sister, Delaney. Delaney is undeniably beautiful, possessing a camera-ready charm and a ruthless, innate instinct for personal branding. Currently, she is building a luxury lifestyle and wellness brand on social media, a venture my mother treats like an impending corporate merger ready to yield massive dividends. Delaney is not simply a daughter in this house. She is the family's most heavily funded and profitable investment project. When Delaney walks into a room, the very temperature seems to change to accommodate her. The dinner conversation immediately pivots to her latest lucrative brand deal, her upcoming trips to the coast, or the aesthetic perfection of her daily routine. She is treated with a delicate, breathless reverence. Her minor, everyday inconveniences are handled like national tragedies requiring immediate intervention, while my major life milestones are routinely swatted away like annoying flies interrupting a photo shoot. My own professional life exists in a mundane realm my family flatly refuses to understand or respect. I work as a senior presentation designer at Marrow Civic Studio, a highly respected agency specializing in visual storytelling for global organizations and large civic institutions. I take incredibly complex data sets, heavy financial projections, and dense strategic plans, and I translate them into compelling, persuasive visual narratives. My daily work directly helps secure millions of dollars in funding for sustainable urban infrastructure and vital public health initiatives. Yet, at the Sunday dinner table, whenever my career is accidentally brought up by a visiting relative, it is immediately and ruthlessly minimized. My mother will wave a perfectly manicured hand and casually tell her friends that I just make pretty slides for boring corporate meetings. My sister will frequently text me late at night, asking me to fix the font on her digital party invitations, fully equating my high-level design strategy with basic word processing. They do not care to understand the weight of my world because it does not directly elevate their social standing. This toxic dynamic is not a recent development born of adulthood. The foundation of this neglect was poured a very long time ago, solidifying into cold concrete when I was just a teenager. The specific memory that still beats like a badly bruised rib inside my chest occurred when I was exactly 17 years old. I had spent 6 grueling months agonizing over an architectural portfolio, pouring every single ounce of my raw talent, sleepless nights, and quiet desperation into a submission for a highly prestigious, state-level design scholarship. Against all the statistical odds, I won the grand prize. It was the proudest, most validating moment of my young life. The formal award ceremony was held on a Tuesday evening in the grand echoing auditorium of the State University. I remember sitting in the very front row with the other nervous recipients, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. I constantly turned around to check the middle section of the theater, where I had proudly saved 3 seats for my parents and my sister. Those 3 velvet seats remained entirely empty. I watched them through the long opening remarks, through the tedious presentation of the minor academic awards, and right through the moment the dean called my full name and I walked across the polished wooden stage to accept my framed certificate. I smiled tightly for the official photographer, holding a heavy piece of paper that suddenly felt completely hollow and meaningless. When I finally returned home late that night, taking the public city bus because no one had bothered to come pick me up, I found our house completely buzzing with chaotic, high-pitched energy. My mother had abruptly taken Delaney to a last-minute casting call for a local fashion boutique's spring promotional campaign. The scholarship, my monumental, life-changing achievement, had simply been erased from the family calendar the exact second an opportunity for Delaney to be photographed arose. Lorraine barely even looked up from steaming a sheer silk dress when I walked through the heavy front door. She only paused to ask if I had grabbed my own dinner on the way home, informing me that the kitchen had already been cleaned and closed for the night. From that exact, agonizing moment onward, something fundamental broke, and then quietly rearranged itself inside my mind. I learned a devastating but absolutely necessary survival skill. I learned exactly how to shrink my own joy before anyone else could do it for me. I stopped sharing my victories at the dinner table. I stopped seeking their validation, because the complete absence of their applause was far more deafening and painful than their everyday silence. I actively molded myself into the low-maintenance daughter. I made sure I did not cause trouble. I never demanded fairness, and I certainly never asked for a prime, comfortable seat at the mahogany table. I simply existed in the faded margins of their vibrant lives, quietly doing the thankless logistical tasks, picking up the heavy slack, and watching them pour all their emotional and financial resources into the golden child. I became the ultimate backup plan, the reliable, unremarkable background character in the ongoing Delaney Chapman show. I accepted my assigned position by the swinging kitchen door, mistakenly believing that if I asked for absolutely nothing, I could not be hurt by receiving absolutely nothing in return. I watched them slowly build their glittering, fragile empire on a deeply unstable foundation of appearances, choosing to ignore the structural rot that was visibly spreading beneath the floorboards. I let them believe I was weak, perfectly compliant, and eternally available for their immediate convenience. But the universe possesses a very precise, unforgiving sense of irony. It would take many years, a spectacularly ignored wedding, and a catastrophic financial collapse to violently shift the balance of power. The day was rapidly approaching when the glittering facade would crack wide open, and the exact same people who had always treated me as a disposable afterthought would find themselves standing in the cold, lining up outside my front door in utter, humiliating desperation. By the time that specific day arrived, however, they would be forced to realize a terrifying truth. I was no longer the quiet, agreeable girl sitting right next to the kitchen door. The air in Asheville always felt distinctly different from Charlotte. It was crisper, entirely lacking the suffocating, heavy humidity of societal expectations that clung to my mother's meticulously curated estate. I had escaped for the weekend to a small, independent bookstore cafe tucked away on a steep, cobblestone side street, seeking a temporary refuge in the comforting scent of roasted dark beans and aging paper. I was on hour 4 of wrestling with a particularly stubborn data visualization for a massive civic housing project, aggressively tapping my keyboard. He was sitting exactly one table over. He did not have a sleek laptop or a glowing tablet. Instead, he was focused on a massive, intimidating stack of thick printed documents, meticulously making notes in the margins with a silver fountain pen. Julian Mercer. He wore a faded navy sweater that looked soft to the touch, and a pair of dark jeans that had actually seen real wear. When he finally looked up, catching me glaring murderously at my frozen screen, he smiled. It was a genuine, quiet smile that reached the corners of his eyes. "Formatting rebellion?" he asked. His voice was a low, steady baritone that instantly made the chaotic noise of the cafe fade into the background. "Something exactly like that," I replied, running a hand through my messy hair. "The numbers refuse to tell the visual story I need them to tell today." He nodded thoughtfully, tapping his silver pen against the mountain of paper on his table. "I spend my days trying to find the actual truth hidden inside the numbers. Usually, it is a much more complicated story than people want to admit." I found myself genuinely smiling back. "What is it that you do?" "I work in risk," he said simply, leaning back in his wooden chair. "Assessing it, mostly, structuring guarantees, mitigating disaster." We ended up talking for 2 solid hours. When we finally left the cafe, I noticed he drove an old, boxy, dark green SUV that rattled slightly when he turned the ignition key. Over the next 6 months, Julian became the quietest, most profound earthquake of my entire life. There were no expensive dinners at restaurants with waiting lists longer than a city block. There were no extravagant, branded gifts designed solely to be photographed and posted online to generate envy. Instead, there was a steady, immovable consistency that I had never experienced before. He remembered that I took my coffee black with exactly 1 sugar packet. He noticed when the stress of a major presentation deadline made my shoulders tense up, silently appearing behind my chair to massage the tight knots away without needing to be asked. Most importantly, when I spoke, he actually listened to me. He never hijacked my sentences midway to pivot the spotlight back onto his own achievements. For the first time in my 32 years of existence, I was sitting across from someone who looked at me not as a useful accessory, not as a reliable backup plan, and certainly not as a disappointment. Julian looked at me as if I were the absolute center of the room, the focal point of the entire narrative. He effortlessly made me realize that genuine kindness does not require a grand stage, a professional lighting crew, or an audience of envious onlookers to be real. Celeste Rowan, my fiercely protective best friend, and a corporate attorney with a razor-sharp instinct for finding blood in the water, was the very first person to squint at the neat, unassuming picture Julian presented. We were sitting in her high-rise downtown apartment on a Friday night, splitting a cheap bottle of red wine after a brutal week. "I like him," Celeste said, swirling the dark liquid in her glass. "I really, genuinely do. He treats you like a queen. But Ariana, you need to open your eyes. A man who is that utterly unbothered, that perfectly comfortable in his own skin, usually has a safety net made of solid gold. He does not panic when the restaurant bill arrives. He does not flinch or look at prices. People who work a standard, mid-level desk job in risk assessment sweat at least a little bit about the economy. Julian does not sweat. He is just grounded," I argued, immediately defensive. "He likes simple things. He drives a car with over 100,000 miles on it." "I am just saying," Celeste countered, leaning forward and tapping her manicured finger on the table. "I deal with insanely wealthy people every single day in my firm. The loudest, flashiest ones are the ones who just got their money and are terrified of losing it. The quiet ones, the ones who wear 10-year-old boots and look at you like they have all the time in the entire world to make a decision. Those are the ones who own the whole damn board. Do not be surprised if your quiet risk guy is playing a much, much bigger game than you realize." I flatly refused to dig any deeper into her theory. I had spent my entire life suffocating under the crushing weight of my family's toxic obsession with wealth, status, and external validation. Money, in my personal experience, was a corrosive acid that ate away at basic human decency and turned mothers into managers. I desperately did not want Julian to be wealthy. I just wanted him to be Julian. I wanted to keep our private sanctuary completely free from the cold, transactional accounting that defined my bloodline. The proposal happened on a crisp Tuesday morning in late October. We had driven up the winding roads to a remote, breathtaking mountainside trail near Highlands. There was no grand, staged setup waiting for us at the top. There were no hired string quartets hiding in the bushes playing romantic music, no professional photographers crouching behind boulders to capture my perfectly shocked reaction for a magazine spread. We were simply standing together on a jagged rocky outcrop, watching the thick morning fog slowly roll over the ancient Appalachian peaks. Julian turned to me, his hands resting casually in his warm coat pockets. He did not drop to one knee in a theatrical, sweeping display. He just looked at me with that same steady, anchoring gaze he had given me in the bookstore cafe on the day we met. "I want to wake up in the exact same house as you for the rest of my life," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "I want to be your family, Ariana." He pulled a small, worn velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside rested a vintage ring, an intricate, beautifully crafted gold band holding a modest, incredibly clear sapphire flanked by two tiny, bright diamonds. It was perfect. It was quiet. It was real. "Yes," I breathed out, the single word feeling heavier and more important than anything I had ever said. The brutal contrast between the profound, soul-deep peace of that mountain and the absolute zero temperature of my family was immediate and violent. On the drive back down the mountain, riding high on a wave of quiet euphoria, I composed a quick text message to the Chapman Family Updates group chat. I attached a simple, unfiltered photo of our hands resting casually together on the center console of his old SUV, the deep blue sapphire catching the bright midday light. "Julian and I are engaged," I typed out, my fingers trembling slightly with a foolish, lingering hope. "We are so incredibly happy." I hit send. I watched the little notification bubbles pop up at the bottom of the screen, showing that my mother, my father, and my sister had all read the message within 2 minutes. Then, the silence stretched out. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. Finally, my phone buzzed sharply in my lap. A single message from my mother. "Lorraine. Oh, how nice. Congratulations." There were no exclamation points. There were no follow-up questions asking how he proposed, where we were, or when we were planning to celebrate as a family. There was no phone call. Exactly 45 seconds later, a second message from Lorraine popped up in the exact same chat thread, completely burying my announcement. "Delaney's Founder Weekend in Santa Barbara is officially locked in for the 24th of next month. I just secured the premium block of ocean view suites at the resort. Everyone needs to book their first-class flights by Friday at the latest. The welcome dinner dress code is strict cream and beige. No exceptions. This is going to be massive for her brand rollout. Delaney replied almost instantly with a long string of sparkling heart emojis. My father chimed in with a simple, generic thumbs-up icon. The group conversation instantaneously transformed into a chaotic, high-speed flood of aesthetic mood boards, luxury catering options, and VIP stylist appointments for my younger sister's big corporate debut. I sat completely frozen in the passenger seat of Julian's rattling green vehicle, staring blankly at the glowing screen of my phone. The silent pivot was flawlessly executed. It was a masterclass in emotional erasure. I had just announced a permanent, life-altering milestone. I had just told my blood relatives that I had found the person I was going to spend my forever with. And the people who shared my last name, the people who were supposed to be my foundation, had reacted with the exact same level of enthusiasm one might show if I had simply announced I was changing the background wallpaper on my cell phone. They stepped right over my joy without even breaking their stride, rushing forward to worship at the altar of Delaney. Julian glanced over at me from the driver's seat, instantly noticing the sudden, sharp shift in my breathing. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not need to. He just reached across the center console, gently covered my freezing hand with his warm one, and held on tight as we drove away from the mountain. The invitation for the Founder Weekend arrived not in a standard envelope, but inside a custom-molded, suede-lined box that required a signature upon delivery. Inside nestled a single piece of thick, decal-edged cotton paper announcing Delaney's dual triumph, the official launch of her signature furniture collection, and a highly anticipated personal announcement. The venue was an ultra-exclusive, impossibly pristine beachfront resort in Santa Barbara, California, a place where the sand looked as though it had been individually polished by a dedicated staff before the sun was allowed to rise. My mother, Lorraine, did not merely plan this weekend. She orchestrated it with the ruthless, terrifying precision of a military general executing a hostile takeover. She treated the event as nothing less than a royal coronation for the Chapman dynasty. For 2 solid months leading up to the trip, the family group chat was a relentless, high-speed barrage of aesthetic directives. We received a digital mood board containing 72 distinct slides outlining the mandatory dress code. We were instructed to wear specific, highly policed shades of cream, bone, alabaster, and ivory. Anything leaning too close to stark white or muddy beige was strictly forbidden, as it would disrupt the visual harmony of the professional photography. Lorraine personally financed first-class airplane tickets for an army of aunts, uncles, and cousins. She booked a block of premium ocean view suites that cost more per night than what I earned in a month. Upon arrival, each favored guest was greeted with a massive welcome box stamped with a newly designed Chapman monogram. These boxes contained silk sleep masks, artisanal sea salt scrubs, and a personalized itinerary printed on gold leaf cardstock. In total, 23 relatives flew across 15 different states, crossing entire time zones to gather on the West Coast. They arrived perfectly styled, phones already recording, ready to document every single manufactured moment. They flooded social media with glowing tributes, celebrating Delaney as if she were a self-made titan of industry rather than a heavily subsidized influencer whose entire business model relied completely on her husband's deep pockets. Naturally, the lavish financial umbrella did not extend to cover my attendance. I paid for my own economy class ticket, enduring a grueling layover in Dallas. I paid for my own standard issue room in a completely different, noticeably cheaper hotel, situated 3 miles inland from the glowing epicenter of the Founder Weekend. When Julian and I finally arrived at the resort's grand ballroom for the opening gala, we were swiftly directed by a woman wearing an earpiece to a small, cramped table located at the absolute outer edge of the room. It was situated perfectly next to the swinging metal doors of the catering station, a location so remarkably similar to my designated spot at the Sunday dinner table in Charlotte, that I almost laughed out loud at the cruel, poetic symmetry. Julian looked immaculate in a tailored, charcoal gray suit that he wore with effortless, quiet confidence. As we sat among the constant clatter of waitstaff rushing by with trays of caviar blinis, he reached under the table and squeezed my knee. He did not complain about the draft from the kitchen door, nor did he mention the fact that my mother had barely offered us a tight, distracted nod when we entered the room before spinning around to bark an order at a lighting technician. About an hour into the evening, Weston Hale decided to grace our peripheral table with his loud, expansive presence. Weston was Delaney's husband, a commercial real estate developer who wore too much expensive cologne and possessed the exhausting energy of a man who firmly believed every room he entered was a stage built entirely for his benefit. His face was already flushed with the vibrant, arrogant heat of several expensive Scotch cocktails. He leaned heavily onto the back of my chair, barely acknowledging my existence, and locked his slightly glazed eyes onto Julian. Julian, Weston boomed, his voice carrying easily over the soft jazz playing in the background. Ariana mentioned you do something with risk? What is that exactly? Insurance? Actuarial tables? Crunching the boring numbers so the rest of us can actually build the skyline? Julian met Weston's loud gaze with a perfectly calm, unbothered expression. He took a slow sip of his sparkling water. Something like that, Julian replied smoothly, his tone remarkably even. Ideal in risk assessment and structured guarantees. Mostly focused on large-scale institutional projects, Weston let out a short, patronizing bark of a laugh, clearly unimpressed by the understated description. He completely dismissed Julian, physically turning his broad shoulders away from us to address a cluster of his wealthy college fraternity brothers who had wandered over to our corner. "You boys want to hear about real risk?" Weston announced loudly to his captivated audience, taking another deep swallow from his crystal glass. "The Marlowe House project. We are completely gutting that historic property downtown, turning it into the most exclusive boutique hotel in the state. The capital requirements are absolutely insane. The city council has been breathing down my neck for months, demanding a massive completion guarantee before they sign off on the final permits. My current backers started getting cold feet. Weak stomachs, the lot of them." Weston leaned in closer to his friends, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial, boastful register that was still entirely audible to everyone sitting at our table. "But I finally cracked the vault, boys," Weston declared, a smug, triumphant grin spreading across his face. "We are in the final stages of locking down a massive bailout guarantee from Northline Fidelity Group. Do you have any idea how completely impossible it is to even get a phone meeting with those guys? They are the absolute apex predators of the financial backing world. They do not talk to anyone. But my brokers managed to slip our portfolio right onto the top desk. Once that ink dries next week, we are untouchable." I froze, my breath catching sharply in my throat. I slowly turned my head to look at Julian. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his expression an absolute, impenetrable mask. He did not blink. He did not interrupt. He simply sat there, quietly listening to this arrogant, heavily intoxicated man brag about conquering a fortress. The profound, staggering irony of the moment was so thick it practically suffocated me. Weston Hale was standing mere inches away from the very architect of his supposed salvation. He was loudly boasting about forcing open the final, impossible door, completely unaware that the man holding the only key to that exact door was sitting right behind him, politely enduring his disrespect. Neither Weston nor any of his captivated friends bothered to turn back around and ask Julian a single follow-up question. In their eyes, we were just the boring relatives sitting by the kitchen, occupying space until the real show began. The climax of the evening occurred just as the sun began to dip below the Pacific horizon, painting the sky in aggressive, fiery shades of orange and bruised purple. The heavy ballroom doors were thrown open, and the crowd was ushered out onto the private beach. Delaney stood on a specially constructed, elevated wooden platform that hovered above the sand. She wore a flowing, custom-draped gown of raw silk that caught the ocean breeze perfectly. Lorraine stood just slightly behind her, vibrating with intense, proprietary pride, her eyes darting around to ensure every hired photographer was capturing the exact right angle. With a theatrical flourish, Delaney pulled a golden ribbon attached to a massive suspended box. Thousands of biodegradable, pale pink confetti pieces exploded into the salty air, raining down over the cheering crowd. It was a girl. The announcement of the brand launch seamlessly merged with the announcement of the pregnancy, creating a masterfully monetized spectacle of human existence. Servers instantly circulated with trays of vintage champagne. The 23 relatives who had flown across the country raised their crystal flutes into the twilight, their voices rising in a loud, unified chorus of celebration. They toasted to Delaney's brilliance, to her expanding family, to her undeniable success. I stood at the very back of the crowd, exactly where the sand met the paved walkway. I did not hold a glass of champagne. As the pale pink confetti drifted down and settled onto the shoulders of my tailored jacket, I raised my hands and began to clap softly. It was a mechanical, hollow motion. In that precise, chilling moment, standing on the edge of that extravagant Californian beach, the final, lingering illusion I held about my family completely shattered. For years, I had quietly rationalized their absence. I had told myself they were too busy, too stressed, too geographically scattered to show up for the quiet milestones of my life. But looking at the sheer scale of this orchestrated perfection, looking at the dozens of relatives who had joyfully sacrificed their weekend to stand in a color-coordinated formation, the brutal truth became undeniable. My family did not lack the necessary time. They did not lack the financial resources. They certainly did not lack the sheer, relentless energy required to show up. They possessed all of those things in massive, overwhelming abundance. They simply lacked the desire to spend a single drop of it on me. I was the structural beam hidden inside the drywall, expected to hold up the weight of the house without ever being seen or celebrated. Delaney was the glittering chandelier hanging from the ceiling, gathering all the light. I stopped clapping. I lowered my hands to my sides, feeling the cool ocean breeze cut through the fabric of my clothes. Beside me, Julian gently placed his hand on the small of my back, a silent, grounding anchor in the midst of the swirling, pink-tinted chaos. I looked away from the cheering crowd and stared out at the dark, vast expanse of the ocean, realizing that the coldness I felt was no longer sadness. It was the absolute, terrifying clarity of total liberation. Highlands, North Carolina, is a place of quiet, ancient magic. The air high up in the mountains always smells of damp pine needles and cold, clean stone. It was not a random or thoughtless choice for my venue. I selected a beautiful, intimate lodge nestled deep in the forest specifically because it was exceptionally accessible. From my parents' sprawling, immaculate estate down in Charlotte, the drive was just a little over 2 hours. You could leave your house after a leisurely breakfast, drive up a well-paved, scenic highway, and arrive comfortably before lunch. There were no connecting flights required, no complicated hotel logistics, no valid geographical hurdles whatsoever. I mailed the thick, understated invitations precisely 3 months in advance, carefully including pre-stamped, pre-addressed response cards to make the process completely frictionless for everyone. Then, I waited. The silence that followed was not sudden. It was a slow, agonizing drip that eroded my spirit day by day. Weeks passed, and my mailbox remained entirely empty. I watched Julian's side of the guest list fill up rapidly with warm, enthusiastic acceptances from family members scattered across the northern and midwestern states. Meanwhile, my side of the ledger remained a blank, echoing void. When the final deadline came and went, I was forced into doing the most humiliating task a bride can undertake. I had to pick up my phone and personally call the people who shared my bloodline, practically begging them to simply check a box on a piece of paper. The responses I received were a masterclass in polite, devastating evasion. My aunt sighed heavily into the receiver. complaining that the air travel to California for Delaney's event the previous month had simply drained her physical reserves, and a 2-hour drive to the mountains felt like an absolute marathon she could not endure. My cousin cited a vague, sudden surge in his corporate workload, conveniently ignoring the fact that he had just spent 5 consecutive days drinking expensive champagne on the West Coast without a single glance at his laptop. An uncle claimed his lower back was acting up due to the changing weather. Others mumbled something about the shifting seasons and feeling terribly fatigued. The repeating chorus was always exactly the same. They had just traveled so much lately. They spoke to me in exhausted, patronizing tones, as if I were demanding they cross a harsh desert on foot, rather than simply asking them to drive a standard vehicle up a highway to witness my wedding vows. The final, lethal blow was delivered exactly 4 days before the ceremony. My mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I answered on the second ring, a foolish, stubborn flicker of hope rising in my chest that perhaps she was calling to finalize a rehearsal dinner detail or offer to help with the floral arrangements. Instead, her voice was brisk, distracted, and utterly devoid of any maternal warmth. "Ariana, darling," Lorraine began, her tone clipping the edges of the words sharply. "I am looking at the schedule, and it is just impossible right now. The warehouse is an absolute disaster with the new inventory, and Delaney is having a terrible time with her morning nausea. You understand, right? It is just a little gathering anyway. It is not like we need to mount a massive production for this. Please do not expect the whole world to stop for a small afternoon thing. It is not exactly like Delaney's launch weekend." She hung up the phone before I could even formulate a breath, let alone a coherent response. I sat entirely alone on my living room sofa, staring at the blank, dark screen of my phone, feeling the walls of the room tilt and compress around me. When I told Celeste what had happened, she did not offer me empty platitudes. She did not pat my hand and tell me they would magically change their minds at the last minute. She poured me a tall glass of cold water, looked me dead in the eye, and gave me the most vital piece of legal and emotional advice I would ever receive. "Stop letting them rewrite your reality," Celeste instructed, her voice fierce and dangerously low. "They are going to do this, and then later, they are going to tell you it was your fault for not accommodating their busy schedules. You need to document it, every single text message, every voicemail, every email. Do not do it to be petty or vindictive right now. Do it so that 10 years from today, when they try to tell you that you are just being overly sensitive and blowing things out of proportion, you have the concrete proof that you are not crazy." I spent the next 48 hours taking precise screenshots, saving audio messages, and forwarding dismissive emails to a secure location on my computer. It felt deeply clinical, almost cold, but the methodical action anchored my spiraling mind. The day of my wedding was devastatingly beautiful. The sky stretching over the Appalachian peaks was a piercing, cloudless blue. The wooden lodge smelled of burning oak and hundreds of fresh white roses. The ceremony space was set up in a lush, green clearing, bordered by towering, ancient pines. As I stood hidden in the bridal suite, looking out through the small glass window at the seating arrangement, the physical manifestation of my family's lifelong neglect was finally laid bare under the bright afternoon sun. On the right side of the wide, grassy aisle, Julian's family filled every single row. They were laughing softly, talking to one another, leaning over the wooden backs of the chairs to embrace relatives they had not seen in years. They had flown in from snowy cities, driven up from the deep south, and navigated complicated travel routes just to be present for him. On the left side of the aisle, my side, the silence was absolute and terrifying. In the very first row sat Celeste, looking fiercely protective in a dark emerald dress. Behind her sat 2 former colleagues from my design studio and a pair of loyal friends I had known since my early college days. Behind them sat 24 completely empty wooden chairs. They were arranged in perfect, meticulous rows, 24 seats that I had personally paid for, decorated with small ribbons, and assigned with careful hope. They stood there as 24 glaring, undeniable monuments to exactly how little I mattered to the people who raised me. The wedding planner, A sweet and highly organized woman came into my dressing room looking frantic and pale. She gently suggested that we ask some of Julian's guests to move over and spread out, to quickly fill in the gaping, ugly holes on my side of the aisle so the professional photographs would look balanced and normal. "No," I told her, my voice dropping into a surprisingly steady, hollow register. "Leave them exactly where they are." I refused to artificially inflate my own worth for the sake of a pretty photo album. I refused to cover up the structural, rotting core of the Chapman family with polite aesthetics and clever camera angles. When the heavy wooden doors opened and I walked down that aisle, gripping my bouquet of white flowers so tightly my knuckles turned white, I did not look away from the void. I looked directly at the 24 empty chairs. I let the brutal, undeniable truth of their physical absence burn itself permanently into my retinas. The profound, suffocating silence radiating from that side of the room was far more terrifying and far more honest than any tears I could have possibly shed. The morning after my wedding, as Julian and I sat together on the private balcony of our secluded cabin, drinking dark coffee in a heavy, peaceful quiet, my phone vibrated sharply against the wooden table. It was a sudden flurry of casual messages in the Chapman family group chat. My aunt sent a brightly smiling digital icon and wrote, "Hope the little party was cute. We will definitely have to get together for lunch sometime before the winter holidays." My cousin chimed in right after with, "Congratulations. Next time you throw a bash, give us a bit more notice so we can actually clear the calendar." They spoke to me as if I had hosted a casual Sunday brunch that simply slipped their minds, not the single most important exchange of vows of my entire life. There was no genuine apology. There was no trace of shame or self-awareness. There was only a casual, breathtaking cruelty wrapped tightly in polite, superficial ignorance. I did not type out a furious reply. I did not demand an explanation. I simply took a clear screenshot of the entire conversation. I opened the file directory on my secure cloud storage drive and created a brand new, empty folder. I named it Receipts. I dragged the new screenshots, the saved voicemails, the dismissive emails from my mother, and a single, high-resolution photograph of the 24 empty wooden chairs into that cold digital vault. As I watched the progress bar complete the final upload, a profound, irreversible shift occurred deep within my chest. The crushing, suffocating weight of lifelong disappointment finally dissolved, replaced by something entirely different, a cold, sharp, and unbreakable resolve. I finally understood that I was completely free. From this day forward, my pain would never again be subjected to their convenient revisionist history. They would never again be able to look me in the eye and casually edit my trauma by telling me I was simply too sensitive or remembering things wrong. I held the ledger now. The ink was dry, and the account of my childhood was permanently closed. For exactly 32 days following the ceremony in the mountains, I existed in a state of absolute, self-imposed exile. I did not formally block their phone numbers, but I systematically muted every single notification thread, group chat, and email chain that bore the Chapman name. The profound lack of incoming traffic on my device was both entirely predictable and deeply liberating. My family simply carried on with their heavily filtered, meticulously curated existence, seemingly unbothered by my sudden, quiet departure from their daily orbit. To them, my withdrawal was likely perceived not as a tragedy, but as a convenient administrative relief. They no longer had to pretend to care about my new life, and they certainly did not have to expend the minimal energy required to ask how my marriage was going. They were far too busy desperately bailing water out of their own sinking ship, a catastrophic crisis they were frantically trying to conceal behind high-gloss social media posts and forced, bright smiles. However, the laws of financial gravity are absolute, and no amount of aesthetic manipulation can hold back a collapsing ledger forever. The structural integrity of Weston Hale's business empire was fundamentally compromised, built entirely on aggressive leverage, fragile promises, and his own blinding arrogance. The Marlowe House renovation, the historic crown jewel he had boasted about so loudly in California, was rapidly mutating into a terminal financial black hole. The construction timeline was delayed by over 8 months due to severe mismanagement. Dozens of subcontractors were actively filing legal liens against the property and threatening to walk off the job site due to massive, mounting unpaid invoices. The most critical, fatal issue, however, was the sudden, terrifying withdrawal of his primary institutional backer. The original financial firm responsible for underwriting the massive performance guarantee had taken a much closer, highly critical look at Weston's chaotic balance sheets. They saw the rampant overspending, the shifting timelines, and the complete lack of operational discipline. They abruptly pulled their support, citing unacceptable, toxic risk parameters. Without a new, airtight guarantee package in place to secure the project, the primary lending bank was contractually obligated to call in the massive construction loan. Weston was no longer just experiencing a temporary cash flow problem. He was staring directly down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar default that would shatter his entire professional reputation. Weston, in his infinite, reckless wisdom, had not isolated this financial radiation to his own company. He had strategically and selfishly infected the entire family ecosystem to artificially prop up his failing venture. To secure cheaper supply lines and falsely inflate his initial budget proposals for the bank, he had awarded the exclusive, massive interior furnishing contracts for the entire hotel directly to my mother's company, Bellwether Home Atelier. Lorraine, completely blinded by the sheer scale of the purchase orders and the intoxicating opportunity to outfit an entire luxury hospitality brand under her own name, had drastically overextended her own supply chains. She had fronted the massive manufacturing costs for hundreds of custom velvet sofas, imported light fixtures, and bespoke dining sets. All of that expensive inventory was currently sitting in a humid, rented warehouse, waiting for a hotel that might never actually open its doors. If Weston went bankrupt and defaulted on his vendor contracts, Bellwether Home Atelier would absorb a devastating, potentially fatal loss, dragging my mother's pristine empire down into the mud with him. The rot, however, went even deeper than furniture contracts. My father, the eternally silent, perpetually conflict-averse Grant Chapman, had committed the ultimate, fatal error of cowardice. Nearly 2 years prior, when Weston desperately needed a rapid injection of liquid capital to bridge a temporary, supposedly minor cash flow gap, Grant had quietly signed a legally binding personal guarantee against a significant portion of the debt. He never breathed a single word of this massive liability to me. By trying to keep the peace, by appeasing my mother's golden son-in-law, and by refusing to ask the hard, uncomfortable questions, my father had effectively strapped his own boutique financial consulting firm and his own personal retirement assets directly to Weston's sinking anchor. If the Marlowe house collapsed, Grant Chapman would be financially ruined alongside him. The absolute cold sweat panic within Weston's corporate office must have been palpable. His highly paid financial team was frantically searching for a miracle, aggressively scraping the bottom of the barrel for any firm willing to assume the massive, radioactive risk of a failing hotel project. Their final, desperate, and entirely unlikely hope rested on a pending application submitted to Northline Fidelity Group. The junior analysts began running the standard, deep dive background checks on Northline's executive structure to find a vulnerable angle, a mutual connection, or any possible leverage to force the heavy doors open. They pulled the corporate registration filings, they scanned the board of directors, and right there, sitting at the absolute apex of the corporate hierarchy, listed in stark black and white ink as the primary founder, majority shareholder, and chief executive officer, was a name that made the blood freeze solid in Weston's veins: Julian Mercer. It was the exact same Julian Mercer who drove a rattling 10-year-old vehicle. The exact same Julian Mercer who had sat quietly at a cramped, drafty table near the catering kitchen in Santa Barbara, politely drinking sparkling water while Weston loudly and publicly mocked his profession. The risk guy they had all completely dismissed was the absolute sovereign of the very institution holding their execution orders. I can only imagine the sheer, suffocating silence that descended upon my parents' pristine mahogany dining table when Weston finally drove over to deliver the devastating news. The revelation did not trigger a profound wave of moral shame. It did not spark a sudden, heartbreaking realization of how poorly, how cruelly they had treated me for 3 decades. My family was fundamentally incapable of that level of genuine introspection. Instead, the shocking discovery merely triggered a violent, immediate recalculation of their available assets. The geographical coordinates of their salvation had simply shifted overnight. The impossible, ironclad fortress of Northline Fidelity Group was no longer an unapproachable corporate monolith in a distant high-rise building. It was suddenly sitting right in my living room. The key to their survival was sleeping in my bed. The news spread through the Chapman bloodline faster than a dry forest fire fueled by heavy winds. Not a single person in that house uttered the phrase, "We really should have driven up to the mountains for her wedding." There was absolutely no remorse for the 24 empty wooden chairs left rotting in the sun. There was only raw, calculated survival instinct. The very first tactical command that left my mother's perfectly lined lips, echoing through their panicked war room, was entirely predictable. "Call Ariana right now," Lorraine commanded, her voice stripping away any pretense of maternal warmth. "Be gentle. We need to bring her back into the fold immediately." For 32 consecutive days, I had been nothing but a ghost to them. I was the difficult, overly sensitive, entirely disposable daughter who had quietly and conveniently removed herself from the playing board. But on the morning of the 33rd day, a crisp, bright Saturday, the entire axis of our family dynamic inverted violently. I woke up slowly, enjoying the quiet, peaceful warmth of the early morning sun filtering through the bedroom blinds. Julian was already awake, reading a thick hardcover book beside me. I rolled over, stretched, and reached for my phone on the wooden nightstand, simply intending to check the local weather forecast for the weekend. As I lifted the device, the screen was completely saturated, illuminated by an aggressive, continuous stream of digital alerts that stacked one on top of the other in rapid succession. There were precisely 214 missed interactions. There were dozens of missed phone calls. There were long, overflowing voicemails marked urgent. There were excessively sweet, frantic text messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not interacted with in months. There were messages from my father, checking in on his favorite girl. There was a long, flowery paragraph from my mother, casually suggesting a lavish Sunday brunch, and there were 3 separate, desperate pleas from Delaney. Overnight, without lifting a single finger, without speaking a single word, I had miraculously transformed from the invisible, ungrateful burden of the family into their sole, desperate, and entirely indispensable lifeline. As I sat up in bed, staring at the glowing screen vibrating endlessly in my palm, I felt a cold, sharp smile slowly form on my lips. The long season of their indifference was officially over, and the era of their absolute, humiliating hunger had just begun. The digital onslaught was not a slow trickle. It was a highly coordinated, relentless tactical assault. Over 200 notifications clogged my phone's screen within a matter of hours. There were frantic voicemails from the exact same aunts and uncles who, just weeks prior, had claimed they were simply too exhausted to drive 2 hours up a scenic mountain highway to witness my wedding vows. Suddenly, they were all suffering from a profound, burning nostalgia for my presence. The woman who had blamed her lower back for missing my ceremony left a high-pitched, breathless audio message declaring how much she missed my face and insisting that the extended family absolutely needed to organize a massive dinner so they could properly get to know Julian. The sheer, breathtaking hypocrisy of it all was almost artistic in its execution. They moved as a synchronized hive, entirely driven by the scent of capital. The virtual siege quickly breached the physical world. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the doorbell of my apartment chimed sharply. I opened the door to find my mother standing on the welcome mat. Lorraine was holding a massive, extravagantly wrapped gift basket overflowing with imported cheeses, artisan crackers, and a heavy bottle of vintage red wine. The moment the door swung open, she lunged forward, pulling me into a suffocating, deeply performative embrace. She patted my back with the exact rhythmic motion of an actress, ensuring the cameras captured the optimal angle of her maternal devotion. I stepped back, allowing her to enter my modest living room. She perched herself on the edge of my sofa, her designer coat clashing loudly with the understated fabric of my furniture. She did not ask how the wedding went. She did not ask if I was happy. She spent exactly 1 minute complimenting the natural lighting in the room before her intense anxiety forced her to pivot with whiplash-inducing speed. "Sss." "Julian," Lorraine began smoothly, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, deeply interested register. "Weston was just telling us the most fascinating things. He mentioned Julian works at Northline Fidelity Group. That is such a massive, intimidating firm. What level is he at, exactly? Is he a senior director? A regional vice president?" I did not offer her a glass of water. I did not sit down beside her. I remained standing perfectly still, crossing my arms over my chest, and looked directly into her meticulously painted eyes. "You did not drive over here because you suddenly missed your daughter," I said, my voice entirely flat, stripped of any anger or sorrow. "You are sitting on my sofa right now because your son-in-law ran a Google search on my husband." The effect was instantaneous and deeply satisfying to witness. The heavy, glossy layer of maternal warmth painted across her face cracked and shattered in a matter of seconds. Her jaw tightened, her eyes darted toward the door, and the calculated, loving mother vanished completely, replaced by a panicked, cornered businesswoman whose supply chain was rapidly collapsing. She opened her mouth to mount a defense, to spin a web of plausible deniability, but the utter coldness in my expression silenced her. She left the gift basket on the table and practically fled my apartment. By evening, the second wave of the assault began. Delaney called. I answered the phone simply to observe the script she had prepared. She utilized her signature, heavily practiced influencer voice, a cloying mixture of honeyed sweetness and weaponized fragility. "I heard Mom came over and things got a little tense." Delaney sighed into the receiver, sounding deeply exhausted by my supposed irrationality. "Listen, you really need to stop being so petty about the whole mountain wedding thing. We are all under a massive amount of stress right now. Weston is barely sleeping. You have to understand that this is the exact moment we need to put family above our own personal feelings. We need to be a united front." The absolute lack of self-awareness was staggering. The golden child, who had happily watched her entire family abandon my milestone to celebrate her branded aesthetic, was now lecturing me on the moral necessity of familial sacrifice. I hung up the phone without saying a single word. Weston, predictably, did not possess the emotional intelligence to attempt a personal phone call. He treated the situation exactly like a hostile corporate negotiation. He sent a lengthy, meticulously formatted email to my personal address. I read it on my laptop screen, marveling at the sheer sociopathy of the text. There was zero warmth, zero acknowledgement of the past. The entire message was built on dense corporate jargon. He typed extensively about leveraging synergy, maximizing mutual upside, and exploring unprecedented opportunities for the whole family to align our financial interests. He boldly suggested a casual lunch meeting between himself, me, and Julian to discuss strategic partnerships. The email made one reality violently clear. In Weston's eyes, I was never a sister-in-law, and I was certainly not a human being. I was simply a stubborn administrative gatekeeper standing between him and the lucrative signature he desperately needed to save his failing hotel project. Then came my father. Grant called early on a Thursday morning, his voice thick with a heavy, trembling hesitation. He was the very first person in the entire family to explicitly bring up the wedding day. "I am sorry," Grant murmured, sounding older and smaller than I had ever heard him. "I am so deeply sorry I was not there to walk you down the aisle. I should have driven up. I know I failed you." If he had made that exact phone call 30 days ago, I might have fallen to my knees and wept. It might have healed a massive, bleeding wound in my chest. but arriving precisely at the exact moment his own financial survival depended entirely on my goodwill. The apology tasted like ash in my mouth. It was not born of genuine paternal remorse. It was a raw, biological survival reflex. He was a man watching the water rise above his chin, finally deciding to apologize to the person standing on the only dry boat in the harbor. I told him his apology was noted, and I ended the call. The siege rapidly escalated. I began actively blocking their phone numbers, one by one. The response was a desperate, chaotic circumvention of my boundaries. They borrowed mobile phones from their warehouse employees to bypass the blocks. They utilized burner numbers and left frantic voicemails from unlisted corporate landlines. My quiet, peaceful sanctuary of an apartment felt entirely surrounded by an army of mercenaries. I was trapped inside a fortress, besieged by a group of people who only ever bothered to knock on a door when they calculated that the person standing on the other side possessed a tangible, redeemable cash value. On Friday night, the tension reached its absolute peak. Julian and I were sitting on the sofa in the dim light of the living room when an unknown number illuminated my phone screen for the 5th time that hour. Julian reached over and gently covered my hand with his. His expression was a storm of quiet, dangerous, protective fury. "Give me the word," Julian said softly, his tone carrying the absolute, crushing weight of a man who commanded an empire. "I will handle this. I can make one phone call to my legal department right now. I will have them draft aggressive cease and desist orders by midnight. I will personally review Weston's portfolio tomorrow morning and permanently shred his application. I will shut every single one of them down so completely they will never dare to speak your name again." I looked at my husband. I felt a profound, overwhelming surge of love for his willingness to become the monster they feared. Just to shield me from their venom, it was the most tempting offer I had ever received. With one nod, the relentless noise would stop, and my tormentors would be instantly crushed by a power they could not comprehend. But I slowly shook my head. I pulled my phone out from under his hand and set it face down on the wooden coffee table. "No," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. "If you step in and crush them for me, they will simply transfer their awe to you. They will respect your wealth. They will cower before your institutional power, and they will continue to look right past me. They will just see me as a lucky girl who managed to marry a heavily armed bodyguard." I stood up from the sofa, feeling the adrenaline flood my system, sharp and cold. "I do not want them to fear my husband," I said, staring out the window into the dark city streets. "I want them to be forced, for the very first time in their miserable lives, to look directly at me." The following Tuesday, the three of us convened around my dining table, treating the polished wood like a war room map. Celeste had brought her heavy leather briefcase, and Julian had brought a thick black portfolio bearing the Northline Fidelity Group crest. We needed to surgically separate the emotional carnage of my family from the cold, hard mathematics of the business dossier. Julian opened his folder first, his demeanor shifting effortlessly from the warm husband I knew to the absolute apex predator of the financial sector. He wanted to be crystal clear that my personal vendetta was not the driving force behind Northline's corporate strategy. "Even if you begged me on your hands and knees to approve this loan," "Ariana," Julian said, his voice carrying the flat, clinical tone of an auditor, "I could not legally authorize it. My underwriting department had already flagged Weston Hale for critical failure weeks before we even flew out to California." Julian laid out the printed spreadsheets. Weston had actively inflated the appraised value of his primary collateral by nearly 40%. He had a verified, documented history of stringing along a massive chain of local subcontractors, leaving critical invoices unpaid for over 90 days while continuing to draw personal management fees. Furthermore, there were massive, undocumented cash withdrawals masking severe operational deficits. The Marlowe House project was not merely a struggling hotel. It was an active financial crime scene. Even without my presence in the equation, the file was destined for the shredder. With the business reality firmly established, Celeste took control of the table. She opened her laptop and helped me systematically organize the massive digital folder I had named Receipts. We did not just look at the raw screenshots. We built a legally unassailable, aggressively detailed timeline. We placed the list of the 23 relatives who happily bought first-class tickets to fly across 15 states directly next to the list of excuses those exact same people gave for being too tired to drive a mere 2 hours to the mountains for my wedding. We matched the exact timestamps of their dismissive text messages with their glowing real-time social media posts celebrating Delaney. The side-by-side comparison was a painfully sharp, undeniable indictment of their collective choices. It was a flawless map of their hypocrisy. But Celeste is a seasoned corporate attorney, and her primary instinct is always to follow the paper trail down to its deepest, darkest roots. While combing through my personal financial documents to ensure my own assets were completely firewalled from Weston's impending bankruptcy, she uncovered a discrepancy that made the air in the room turn to ice. When my maternal grandmother passed away, she had established a modest trust fund in my name. The specific stipulations of the trust dictated that the funds were to be unlocked and dispersed upon the legal registration of my marriage. I had completely forgotten about its existence amidst the agonizing chaos of the wedding planning. Celeste ran a routine legal inquiry to the holding bank to initiate the transfer of the assets. The bank returned the inquiry. The account was practically empty. My father, Grant Chapman, acting as the primary legal custodian of the account during my early 20s, had authorized a massive, supposedly temporary withdrawal many years ago. The paper trail was perfectly, terrifyingly clear. He had quietly siphoned off nearly 80% of my inheritance. He had not stolen it to buy a sports car. He had taken it to quietly patch a disastrous, early financial hole left by one of Delaney's failed boutique ventures. I sat completely frozen in my chair, staring blindly at the printed bank statement Celeste slid across the table. This revelation was an entirely different species of betrayal. It bypassed the emotional neglect and ventured directly into systemic parasitism. They had not merely ignored my wedding day. They had systematically, silently cannibalized my personal future to ensure my sister's aesthetic survival. My father had literally signed away my grandmother's blessing, stealing my financial security to buy Delaney another chance at the spotlight, all while maintaining his cowardly silence at the Sunday dinner table. The ground beneath my feet was already shifting violently, but the final, sickening revelation came from the promotional materials Weston had blindly submitted to Northline Fidelity Group. Julian reached into his portfolio and handed me a glossy, thick pitch deck detailing the conceptual vision for Delaney's upcoming flagship showroom, the very project she was currently using to lure wealthy investors. I opened the booklet, and the air rushed completely out of my lungs. The layout, the structural flow of the retail space, the specific integration of natural light features, and the entire narrative branding strategy were not just vaguely similar. They were identical to a comprehensive, 60-page design proposal I had painstakingly built for my mother's company exactly 2 years ago. At the time, I had worked nights and weekends to create it for free, hoping to finally earn her professional respect. Lorraine had casually dismissed my work as too avant-garde and entirely unusable, tossing it aside without a single word of thanks. "They stole it," I whispered, tracing the lines of a floor plan I had drawn by hand with my own stylus. Celeste, fueled by a terrifying, righteous anger, immediately initiated a deep forensic search through the forwarded email chains Weston had carelessly attached to his loan application as supporting documentation. It took her exactly 20 minutes to find the smoking gun. It was an internal corporate message sent directly from Lorraine to Delaney. I read the words printed on the glowing screen, feeling a cold, metallic taste flood my mouth. Lorraine had attached my original design file to the email with a single, devastating sentence. "Ariana is not going to use this anyway. Just take the main ideas." We sat in heavy, suffocating silence in my living room. The sheer depth of their exploitation was absolute. They had taken my peace, they had secretly drained my money, and they had blatantly stolen my intellect, all while actively convincing the world that I was the difficult, untalented daughter. Just as Celeste firmly closed her laptop, the mail carrier dropped a thick envelope through the brass slot in my front door. I walked over and picked it up. It was an official, heavy cardstock invitation to the investor preview night for Delaney and Weston's new showroom, located in the trendy South End district. The grand event was scheduled for next Friday. The invitation proudly boasted that the evening would gather prominent local press, wealthy private investors, and top-tier suppliers. It was abundantly clear what they were attempting to do with this piece of paper. They were constructing a massive, highly publicized stage. They wanted to force me into a room filled with flashing cameras, influential people, and industry peers, banking entirely on my lifelong, deeply ingrained habit of staying quiet to keep the peace. They fully expected me to show up, smile for the family photographs, play the role of the supportive sister, and silently bless their fraudulent empire so the bank would finally release their money. They thought they had cornered me in public. The atmosphere in our social circles grew incredibly thick and suffocating as the investor preview night approached. It was exactly like living inside a massive glass balloon that was being continuously pumped with highly pressurized air. Everyone could clearly see the transparent surface stretching, warping, and threatening to shatter into a million jagged pieces. Yet everyone simply smiled and pretended the tension did not exist. My mother, Lorraine, was the primary architect of this grand, desperate illusion. Through the local society grapevines and country club whispers, word quickly reached me that she had personally purchased a massive, incredibly expensive VIP table situated directly in the center of the new South End retail space. She was actively planting seeds with every influential person she knew, aggressively pushing a narrative that Friday night was going to be a beautiful, heartwarming family reunion. In her deeply distorted reality, she genuinely believed that if she could just arrange the seating chart perfectly, dim the overhead lights to a warm, flattering amber, and hire a professional photographer to capture us holding crystal champagne flutes together, she could completely overwrite history. She thought a well-lit group photograph could erase the profound, echoing silence of the mountains. On Wednesday evening, my phone screen illuminated with a private, direct message from Delaney. It was the longest text she had ever sent me that did not contain a single aesthetic mood board or a demanding request for my free graphic design labor. I read the words carefully, studying the underlying psychology of her panic. She typed that she was genuinely overwhelmed and that she honestly did not know things had gone this incredibly far. For a brief, fleeting second, the tone felt remarkably different from her usual polished arrogance. It sounded like a woman who was finally realizing that the glittering, expensive pedestal she stood on was actively crumbling beneath her designer shoes. I could distinctly feel her standing on a terrifying precipice, torn violently between the crippling fear of losing her glamorous, heavily sponsored life and a quiet, deeply buried conscience that was waking up entirely too late. However, right at the very end of the lengthy paragraph, her survival instinct brutally overpowered her momentary guilt. She added a final, desperate sentence. She begged me to understand that Weston really just needed exactly 10 minutes of Julian's time at the party to clarify a minor misunderstanding with the loan application. It was a tragic, predictable pivot. Her rare apology was not a bridge. It was simply a toll booth. She was only reaching out because the bank was threatening to close her doors permanently. I sat in my living room, staring at her message, and chose not to reply. Julian was sitting in the armchair across from me, reviewing a dense legal contract. He did not ask me what Delaney had said, and he certainly did not pressure me to make a decision about attending the upcoming event. His support was a quiet, immovable foundation. He simply closed his leather portfolio, stood up, and walked over to hand me a thick, sealed manila envelope. The front was stamped with the official seal of Northline Fidelity Group's legal department. "I will never tell you what to do regarding your blood relatives," Julian said, his voice a steady, comforting anchor in the swirling chaos. "If you want to stay home, we will lock the doors, turn off our phones, and watch a movie. If you want to go, I will stand right beside you. But if you do decide to walk into that room, I want you to carry this," He tapped the heavy paper. "Weston is a desperate man, and desperate men lie loudly when they are cornered in public. He will try to spin his financial failure into a personal vendetta. He will attempt to tell those wealthy investors that Northline rejected his application out of petty family spite. This envelope contains the official, legally binding rejection letter from my underwriting team, explicitly detailing his inflated assets, his unpaid contractors, and his fraudulent accounting practices. It proves that the rejection was purely an objective, professional execution. No one gets to twist our professional integrity to save their fragile ego." I took the envelope, feeling its solid weight in my hands. It was a powerful shield, but I also needed a sword. That was where Celeste came in. My brilliant, ruthless friend arrived at my apartment the following evening carrying a sleek black leather folder. She sat down at my kitchen island and methodically arranged the weapons she had forged. It was a perfectly organized, highly sanitized legal dossier of my family's lifelong betrayal. Celeste had printed out the exact email where Lorraine had explicitly instructed the extended family to skip my ceremony, casually referring to the most important day of my life as my little wedding so they would not waste their time. She included the legally certified bank statements documenting my father's quiet, devastating withdrawal from my grandmother's trust fund, highlighting the precise date he drained my future to pay for a financial disaster connected to Delaney. Right behind that, she placed the undeniable side-by-side visual comparison of the stolen showroom concept. She had placed my original date-stamped design files directly next to the glossy promotional brochures Weston was currently handing out to his investors. Every single line, every narrative structure, every spatial arrangement was an exact match. It was a masterfully compiled record of theft, both emotional and intellectual. "You do not have to use any of this," Celeste told me, her sharp eyes studying my face. "But if they try to back you into a corner, if they try to force you to smile and play the compliant, forgiving daughter for the local press, you pull the ripcord. You let them know that you hold all the cards." Meanwhile, the external pressure was mounting exponentially. The local Charlotte media outlets were aggressively promoting the upcoming event. Lifestyle magazines and business blogs were running glowing, preemptive features on Delaney, painting her as the ultimate emblem of the modern Southern-style businesswoman. They highlighted the South End showroom as the crown jewel of her expanding empire. The stakes had been artificially inflated to an absolute maximum. The room on Friday night was going to be packed with prominent journalists, wealthy private equity managers, and top-tier luxury suppliers. Everyone attending had a massive, vested interest in maintaining the flawless facade. It was an environment where keeping up appearances was not just a social courtesy, it was a strict economic requirement. My family desperately needed me to walk into that brightly lit space and silently validate their lies with my physical presence. I spent hours thinking about the 24 empty wooden chairs in the mountains. I thought about the cold draft by the kitchen door that I had endured for years. I thought about the architecture scholarship they completely ignored, the money they secretly took, and the ideas they blatantly stole. And then, I made my absolute final decision. I was going to RSVP, yes. I was not going to that showroom to save Weston's sinking hotel project. I was not going to absorb their vague, conditional apologies wrapped up in corporate synergy. I was going to attend because, for my entire existence, I had allowed them to dictate my physical and emotional posture. I had always made myself small so their massive egos could comfortably expand, but that era was completely over. I was going to walk directly into the glittering, high-stakes arena they had meticulously constructed, and I was going to stand up entirely straight. On the evening of the preview, the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across my bedroom floor. I stood alone in front of the tall wooden mirror, carefully slipping into a tailored, minimalist dress the color of dark midnight. The fabric was heavy, structured, and completely devoid of the chaotic, ruffled embellishments my mother always tried to force upon me. It was not cream, it was not bone, and it was certainly not beige. It was a dress designed for a woman who did not need to catch the light because she generated her own. I smoothed the dark fabric over my hips, looking directly into my own eyes in the reflection. My heartbeat was incredibly steady, drumming a calm, even rhythm against my ribs. There was no familiar flutter of anxiety, no deep, gnawing fear of saying the wrong thing and upsetting the delicate familial balance. I picked up the black leather folder Celeste had prepared, placing Julian's sealed legal envelope securely inside it. As I fastened my watch around my wrist, a profound, quiet realization settled over my shoulders. For the very first time in my 32 years of life, I was preparing to step into a room entirely designed and controlled by my family, and I was not the slightest bit afraid of how they would define me. The heavy swinging kitchen door was finally closed. I was the one holding the keys now. Exactly 24 hours before the grand investor event in the South End district, the final, fragile layers of my family's carefully constructed mythology began to violently peel away. It started on Thursday morning. Celeste arrived at my apartment before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. She did not bother knocking. She simply unlocked the front door with her spare key and marched straight into my kitchen. Her face set in a grim, terrifying mask of triumph. She placed her phone flat on the granite counter and slid it toward me. "A disgruntled second cousin just forwarded this to me," Celeste said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Apparently, Lorraine did not give her a premium VIP seat for tomorrow night, so she decided to burn the entire house down out of spite. I looked down at the glowing screen. It was a clear, high-resolution screenshot of a private group chat, an exclusive digital room I was obviously never invited to join. The timestamp was dated precisely 3 weeks before my wedding day. The message was sent directly from my mother's personal phone. I read the words, feeling the blood slowly drain from my face. Lorraine Chapman had typed, "Listen everyone, Delaney's brand launch is going to require our absolute, undivided energy. She needs the family to appear completely united and focused on the West Coast that week. Do not exhaust yourselves driving out to the mountains for Ariana's little gathering. It is just a minor thing. We have much bigger priorities right now, and I need you all looking fresh and rested for the cameras in California." The revelation struck me with the physical force of a heavy blow to the ribs. This single image completely obliterated any lingering, pathetic delusions I might have harbored about bad backs, heavy workloads, or seasonal fatigue. The 24 empty wooden chairs at my ceremony were not the unfortunate result of a scheduling conflict. They were the direct result of a calculated, top-down boycott, commanded by the matriarch of the family and obediently executed by the rest of the bloodline. My mother had actively campaigned against my joy, to ensure my sister maintained an absolute monopoly on the family's attention. The toxic adrenaline from that discovery had barely settled in my veins when the sun finally went down, plunging the city into a deep, bruised twilight. My phone vibrated loudly on the wooden coffee table. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I answered it, placing the device on the speaker setting so the sound could fill the empty living room. "Ariana," Grant began. His voice was a thin, ragged rasp, the sound of a man who had finally run out of places to hide. "I need to tell you something before tomorrow night. Something about your grandmother's trust fund." I did not interrupt him. I let him stumble through the humiliating confession. He admitted that many years ago. He had signed the authorization papers to temporarily borrow the money from my account. He spun a pathetic, desperate narrative about Weston needing immediate liquid capital for an early real estate venture, and Delaney crying in his office, begging him to save her husband's reputation. Grant swore he had extracted a firm promise from Weston to replenish the account after the deal closed, a promise that, naturally, vanished into thin air. But the most revealing part of his confession was not the theft itself. It was the exact timing of his guilt. "The Marlowe House project is collapsing." "Ariana," my father whispered, sheer panic vibrating through the speaker. "If Weston defaults on his massive loans, the primary lenders are going to initiate a full forensic audit of all his associated accounts and early investors. They are going to drag every single old financial document into the light. They will find the unauthorized transfer from your trust, The secret is going to break wide open, no matter what we do. I just wanted you to hear it from me first." He was not calling to clear his heavy conscience. He was calling because the financial hounds were already actively scratching at the door, and he was desperately trying to control the narrative before the bank ripped his pristine reputation to shreds. He was trying to preemptively manage his own destruction. I terminated the call without giving him a single word of absolution. Less than an hour later, Julian walked through the front door. He did not bother taking off his dark wool coat. He walked straight into the living room, carrying a secure encrypted tablet from the Northline Fidelity Group Investigation Department. His jaw was locked tight, his eyes burning with a cold, protective fury. "My compliance team just finished the deep dive review of Weston's loan application," Julian said, setting the heavy tablet down in front of me. "We found something that crosses the line from gross financial incompetence directly into federal wire fraud." I tapped the screen. The document displayed was the formal marketing and architectural pitch deck Weston had submitted to the bank to secure his multi-million-dollar guarantee. Northline's investigators had run a routine digital background check on the visual assets. "He did not just borrow your general design concepts," Julian explained, his voice dangerously low. "Weston took the exact digital rendering files you created 2 years ago. He submitted them to a major financial institution as proprietary assets owned by his development firm. The metadata embedded in those specific image files still contains your original digital signature and creation dates. He is actively using stolen intellectual property to secure a massive corporate bailout." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the crime locked my lungs in place. My personal pain was suddenly running parallel to a massive, undeniable professional felony. They had treated my career as a silly, insignificant hobby, mocking my work as merely making pretty slides, right up until the exact moment my genius became incredibly lucrative for them. Then, they quietly harvested it, stripped my name away, and used it to build a fraudulent empire. The apartment was completely silent, the kind of heavy pressurized quiet that precedes a massive storm. It was nearly midnight when my phone lit up for the final time. Delaney was calling. I answered the call and pressed the cold glass to my ear. My sister was weeping uncontrollably, her breath catching in jagged, theatrical gasps. "I just saw the text message Mom sent about your wedding," Delaney sobbed, playing the role of the horrified, innocent bystander flawlessly. "I swear to you, Ariana, I had absolutely no idea she told everyone not to come. I never would have allowed that. You have to believe me. I am so devastated." I let her cry. I listened to the hollow, echoing sound of her performance until she finally ran out of breath. The darkness in my apartment felt absolute. "Delaney," I said, my voice completely stripped of any emotion, cold and smooth as polished marble. "Did you know that the entire concept file you submitted to the bank for your new showroom was my stolen intellectual property?" The weeping stopped instantly. The silence that poured out of the receiver was absolute, thick, and profoundly guilty. 10 seconds passed. 15 seconds. She did not deny it. She did not gasp in shock. She simply stopped breathing, completely paralyzed by the sudden realization that the ground beneath her feet had just vanished. That long, terrifying silence was the only confession I ever needed to hear. I hung up the phone. I stood up from the sofa and walked over to the dining table. I picked up the printed screenshot of my mother's betrayal. I picked up the verified bank statements exposing my father's theft. I picked up the digital forensic report from Northline detailing Weston's corporate fraud. I meticulously stacked the pages together, ensuring the edges were perfectly aligned, and slid them into a single, thin black folder. I placed the folder flat on the polished wood. I turned and looked at Julian, who was watching me from the shadows of the room. The fear, the hesitation, the lifelong habit of shrinking myself to fit into their world had been completely burned away, leaving only a sharp, unbreakable steel behind. "Tomorrow night," I said, my voice ringing with a terrifying clarity. "I am not going to that showroom to argue with them. I am going to end it." The investor preview night in the South End district was a masterclass in aggressive, high-gloss deception. The massive industrial space had been transformed into a gleaming temple of lifestyle branding, bathed in warm, flattering amber light. Photographers from local society magazines circled the room, snapping pictures of wealthy private investors, regional bank representatives, and top-tier suppliers holding delicate crystal glasses. At the very center of it all stood Delaney, wearing a flawless designer gown, radiant and perfectly positioned as the fresh, visionary face of the brand. Right beside her was my mother, Lorraine, wearing the impossibly proud, glowing smile of a woman who believed she had successfully engineered a dynasty. The moment Julian and I stepped through the heavy glass doors, the entire gravitational pull of the room seemed to violently shift. Lorraine's sharp eyes locked onto us instantly. She abandoned a conversation with a prominent local journalist and surged forward, her arms extended wide for a highly publicized, theatrical embrace. Weston was right on her heels, swirling an expensive cocktail, his face fixed in a tight, desperate grin. He was clearly ready to utilize our arrival as a living, breathing prop, eager to show his skeptical financial backers that the Chapman family was an unbreakable, united front. I did not step forward to accept the embrace. I stopped perfectly still, forcing Lorraine to awkwardly drop her arms in front of the flashing cameras. I did not raise my voice, but the acoustic design of the showroom carried my words with a terrifying, icy clarity to the surrounding VIP tables. "It is remarkably funny," I stated, locking eyes with my mother. A simple 2-hour drive to witness my wedding vows was considered entirely too exhausting for this family. Yet, flying across 15 states to celebrate Delaney, and physically pushing your way through this crowded room tonight just to corner my husband, is suddenly incredibly convenient. A sharp, collective intake of breath rippled through the nearest cluster of guests. The bright, confident mask on Lorraine's face slipped, instantly replaced by the frantic, defensive posture of a professional victim. She pressed a hand to her chest, her voice trembling with manufactured hurt. "Ariana, how can you do this right now?" Lorraine whispered fiercely, glancing around at the staring investors. "Tonight is about family. We have apologized for the scheduling mix-up. Please do not ruin your sister's biggest moment over a simple misunderstanding." I opened the black leather folder I carried under my arm. I pulled out the crisp, high-resolution printout of the private family group chat. I held it up, ensuring the local journalist standing a few feet away could clearly see the blue text bubbles. "It was not a scheduling mix-up," I replied, my voice slicing through the soft background music. "Let me read your exact words to the family. Do not exhaust yourselves driving out to the mountains. Do not waste a Saturday on Ariana's little gathering. We have bigger priorities. You orchestrated a total boycott to ensure the spotlight remained exactly where you wanted it." The heavy, polished layer of moral superiority shattered into pieces across the showroom floor. The wealthy investors standing nearby fell entirely silent, their eyes darting uncomfortably between my mother's pale, horrified face and the undeniable proof in my hand. Weston desperately tried to hijack the narrative, stepping between me and the crowd. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project the dominant aura of a seasoned corporate leader. "Listen, everyone," Weston announced loudly with a forced, booming laugh. "Private family squabbles have absolutely no place on the showroom floor. We are all adults here. Let us not allow a petty emotional dispute to derail a multi-million-dollar business opportunity." That was the exact moment Julian moved. My husband stepped forward, bypassing Weston entirely, and approached the glass display table where 2 senior representatives from the primary lending bank were standing. Julian withdrew the sealed manila envelope from his dark wool coat and placed it deliberately onto the glass surface. "There is no business opportunity remaining to derail," Julian announced. His voice was not loud, but it commanded an absolute, crushing authority. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Northline Fidelity Group. My underwriting department has formally rejected the guarantee application for the Marlowe House project. We found undeniable evidence of massively inflated collateral, a staggering chain of unpaid subcontractors, and severe, intentional misrepresentation of assets. Weston's face drained of all color, shifting to a sickening, ashen gray. He opened his mouth to argue, but Julian raised a single, commanding hand, cutting him off completely. But I was not finished. The financial execution was Julian's domain, but the final devastating blow belonged entirely to me. I turned to face my sister, who was staring at us with wide, terrified eyes. "And speaking of misrepresented assets," I said, gesturing broadly to the massive architectural blueprints and conceptual mood boards hanging proudly on the showroom walls. "Every single design concept in this room is stolen property. The spatial flow, the branding narrative, the visual aesthetics, those are the exact digital files I created 2 years ago. Files my mother told me were useless. Right before she secretly handed them over to you to secure your funding." Delaney physically stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the polished concrete floor. The golden child was completely stripped of her armor. For the very first time, she could not act her way out of the room. The horrifying realization crashed down upon her that her entire glittering empire was a hollow fraud, built directly on the stolen labor and the stolen time of the sister she had always looked down upon. "We can fix this," Grant stammered from the edge of the crowd, his voice shaking with absolute terror as he watched his financial life raft sink to the bottom of the ocean. "Ariana, please. The trust fund. I can explain the withdrawal. I will pay you back every single cent I borrowed." Lorraine hissed at him to stay quiet, practically lunging forward to grab his arm, but the damage was irreversible. The words had already echoed across the silent room. The bankers, the press, and the suppliers all stared at the Chapman family with open, undeniable disgust. The illusion was dead. Everyone in that room finally understood the brutal truth. My family did not miss my wedding because they were busy. They missed it because they had drained my bank accounts, stolen my intellectual property, and decided I was no longer a valuable investment. Weston completely lost his composure, shouting panicked, incoherent threats at the banking representatives, while my mother desperately tried to usher the journalists away from the scene. Delaney just stood there, weeping silently, the reality of her own profound emptiness finally crushing her. Lorraine turned back to me, tears streaming down her face, begging for a private conversation, begging for a chance to make it right. "No," I said, snapping the black leather folder shut. The sound was as definitive as a judge's gavel. "There is absolutely nothing left to discuss. My attorney, Celeste, will be contacting you on Monday morning regarding the federal copyright infringement and the stolen trust funds. As for the rest of it, our relationship permanently ended the day I walked down the aisle and looked at 24 empty wooden chairs." I turned my back on them. I reached out, took Julian's hand, and walked directly toward the exit. The crowd of wealthy guests silently parted to let us through. I walked out of the bright, suffocating showroom and stepped into the cool, crisp night air, and I did not look back over my shoulder a single time. Several months later, the dust finally settled. Weston's real estate company filed for massive bankruptcy, dragging my mother's luxury furniture chain down into a grueling, highly publicized liquidation process. Freed from the heavy, toxic anchor of their expectations, I opened my own independent design studio using my own name. Within my first quarter of operation, I secured a massive, lucrative contract with a prominent cultural institution, a victory won entirely on my own merit, without a single stolen file or borrowed connection. Yesterday morning, a heavy cream-colored envelope arrived at my office. It was a handwritten letter from Delaney. For the very first time in her life, she did not ask me for free labor. She did not ask for a financial bailout. She did not demand an introduction to my husband's network. She simply asked for a chance to have a cup of coffee. She asked for an opportunity to start over, to learn how to be a real sister instead of a brand ambassador. I folded the letter and placed it gently into the top drawer of my wooden desk. I did not write a reply. I am not entirely sure if I ever will. But as I sat in my sunlit office, looking out over the city skyline, a profound sense of peace washed over me. The power dynamic had permanently shifted. The door between us was finally closed, and for the rest of my life, I am the only person holding the key. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.